Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going on a truly profound theological journey. We're going to explore the biblical reality of our mortal lives and, honestly, trace a really beautiful path straight toward God's sovereign providence. If you've ever felt like you are constantly chasing after success, wealth, or just some kind of satisfaction, only to end up feeling totally empty, well, you're absolutely not alone. So let's strip away all our reliance on earthly achievements and dive deep into the divine wisdom found in the book of Ecclesiastes.
Right out of the gate, the author of this book, known as the Preacher, confronts us with a disorienting, almost shocking truth about human striving. In Ecclesiastes Chapter 1, verse 2, he says, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Boom. Just like that, the Preacher completely dismantles the illusion that our independent earthly efforts have any lasting eternal weight. It's a massive wake-up call to believers, really challenging us to evaluate what we're actually building our lives upon.
Now, to truly grasp this biblical text, we have to introduce the foundational Hebrew concept of Hebel. It's often translated as vanity, but its literal meaning is more like a vapor or a breath. Think of a thick fog early in the morning. I mean, it looks solid, right? It obscures your vision. But the second you try to grab it with your hands, it just slips right through your fingers. Without God's plan anchoring our lives, all of human effort, our greatest achievements, our grandest legacies, they're just like that smoke. They are highly visible for a fleeting moment, but entirely impossible to hold on to.
And that brings us right into Ecclesiastes, Chapter 1. Here, we're looking at this concept of Hebel through the relentless cycles of creation and the strict limits of human wisdom.
The Preacher points directly to the natural cycles of creation. The sun rising and setting, the wind circulating endlessly, rivers flowing into the sea without ever actually filling it. And it all culminates in Ecclesiastes Chapter 1, verse 9, which says, "There is no new thing under the sun." Now that phrase, "under the sun," that's absolutely critical here. It describes a strictly earthly perspective, basically a life lived entirely apart from God's heavenly plan. From that secular viewpoint, creation offers no true innovation and no lasting satisfaction for mankind. It's just a repetitive, exhausting cycle.
Moving forward into Ecclesiastes Chapter 2, we observe this grand, really ambitious experiment in human pleasure and wealth, which, as we'll see, ultimately reveals its utter futility. This brings us to a vital turning point. Just consider life under the sun. As Ecclesiastes Chapter 2, verse 16 reminds us, the wise man and the fool, well, they both die alike. Death is the great equalizer that totally mocks our earthly ambitions. But in sharp contrast, look at life from God's hand. In Ecclesiastes Chapter 2, verse 24, the Preacher realizes that the capacity to actually enjoy eating, drinking, and simple daily toil, that is a divine gift. You can't just manufacture joy out of nowhere. You can only receive it gracefully from the Creator. That realization brings us beautifully right into Ecclesiastes Chapter 3, shifting our gaze entirely from human emptiness to the incredibly comforting reality of providence.
Looking at that famous poem starting in Ecclesiastes Chapter 3, verse 1, we see so clearly that all seasons of life are governed not by blind chance, but meticulously by God's sovereign plan. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. Now, we often get really anxious when we can't control our circumstances, right? But this truth is a massive theological anchor for the believer. It reassures us that literally every season, even the tough seasons of weeping and mourning, has a designated, purposeful time under God's watchful providence.
The really crucial point here is captured perfectly in Ecclesiastes Chapter 3, verse 11. He has also set eternity in the human heart. So why does this matter? Well, because it explains exactly why temporary earthly materials can never, ever fully satisfy our souls. God designed us this way. He hardwired us for the eternal. When we try to stuff our infinite, God-given longing with finite, vaporous things like money, status, or pleasure, we are always going to be left starving. We are made for Him, and our hearts will be restless until they finally rest in His eternal plan.
As we progress to Ecclesiastes Chapter 4, the focus shifts a bit to human companionship and the dark underbelly of human ambition, where sinful rivalry breeds some really deep isolation.
But the antidote to all that isolation is found in Ecclesiastes Chapter 4, verse 12, which gives us this beautiful image. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. The huge takeaway here is the stark contrast between the emptiness of selfish ambition and the immense spiritual strength we find in godly companionship. You see, a cord of 3 strands isn't just about basic human friendship. On a much deeper level, it points to a relationship where God himself is the binding central strand between people. When God is at the dead center of our relationships, we can withstand the absolute harshest storms of this fallen world.
As we navigate into Ecclesiastes chapters 5 and 6, the tone gets highly practical. We have to confront our dangerous attitudes toward wealth and our desperate need for reverence before the Creator.
Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 2 gives us this incredible instruction. God is in heaven, and you're on earth, so let your words be few. Look, before we even start talking about money, we have to check our spiritual posture. We're instructed to approach God with profound awe. Too often, we rush right into prayer, making rash promises, foolish vows, or even empty demands. But this verse, it teaches us the beautiful discipline of choosing to listen humbly. It fully acknowledges the massive distinction between the holy Creator in heaven and us, his finite creatures here on earth.
Maintaining that reverence completely changes how we view the things of this earth. We start to see the absolute tragedy of accumulating wealth without the divine blessing to actually enjoy it. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 10 warns us that loving money brings 0 satisfaction. None. And wealth? It can vanish overnight in a disaster. Plus, as Ecclesiastes chapter 6 points out, even if you live a super long life and have a massive family, it means absolutely nothing if your soul isn't satisfied. Actually, you might labor your whole entire life only for a total stranger to inherit it all.
All of this builds to a very natural, really pressing question. If wealth, status, and earthly success absolutely cannot satisfy the soul, then what in the world can? How do we possibly bridge the gap between the vain pursuit of riches and the true everlasting source of joy?
Well, the theological resolution is found right in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 19. True joy is accepting your portion as a distinct gift from God. The capacity to enjoy our daily life, to find peace in our families, to just enjoy the food on our tables, this is entirely independent of how much we possess in our bank accounts. Joy is not a product of accumulation. Joy is a divine provision. When we finally surrender our sense of entitlement and receive today as a gift from God's hand, that is when we experience true spiritual contentment.
Finally, we reach Ecclesiastes chapter 7. This is where the preacher offers some deeply paradoxical spiritual wisdom on how to live righteously in light of our own mortality.
There is a profound paradox presented in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2. The preacher actually says it is better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. Now, why on earth would he say that? Because a house of feasting tempts us into frivolous joy, completely distracting us from the reality of our limits. But a house of mourning, like a funeral, forces us to contemplate life's end. Facing death teaches us our frailty. It totally strips away our pride and honestly teaches us far more about relying on God's providence than a superficial party ever could.
The preacher concludes this section with a definitive theological statement on the human condition in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 29. God made mankind upright, but men have gone in search of many schemes. God's original creation was perfectly upright, perfectly good. It's human pride, our own rebellion, and our worldly schemes that brought about the spiritual complications, the vanity, and that vapor we suffer through today. We broke the design by trying to be our own gods. As we close this explainer, I want to leave you with a really challenging thought. How does recognizing your own mortality shift your trust from earthly smoke to God's eternal providence? Think about that for a second. When we realize that our days are numbered and our earthly achievements are just vapor, it shouldn't lead us to despair. Not at all. Instead, it should drive us straight into the arms of the Creator. So I invite you today to stop chasing the wind and to anchor your true joy entirely in God's eternal plan. Thank you so much for joining me on this profound journey through the Word. Keep your eyes on Him, and I'll see you in the next one.